Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always. What are we exploring today?
Today, we're going deep into the life of Alexander the Great.
Alexander. Conqueror, military genius.
Exactly. But we're going beyond the typical great conqueror narrative.
Oh, sounds intriguing. What's our source material?
We're working with excerpts from Alexander the Great, Shadows Behind the Glory. The title kind of gives it away.
Shadows behind the glory, huh? I'm guessing we're going to uncover some of those less heroic aspects of his life.
You got it.
Right.
We'll explore the controversies and complexities that often get overlooked, the stuff that makes history so fascinating.
The stuff that reminds us that even legendary figures were real people. Flawed, ambitious, driven.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's kick things off with Alexander's rise to power. And let's just say it wasn't exactly a smooth transition.
Wasn't his father assassinated?
Yeah, King Phil II was murdered in 336 BCE, and the circumstances are still a bit murky.
Our text mentions a disgruntled bodyguard, right? But also hints at other possibilities.
It suggests that Alexander and his mother, Olympias, might have been involved.
Now that's a juicy conspiracy. But what would their motive be? Why eliminate the king?
Power, of course. Olympias wanted to secure Alexander's claim to the throne, especially since Philip had recently taken a new wife.
Ah, so a new wife meant a potential new heir. That would definitely jeopardize Alexander's position.
Exactly. And Olympias wasn't about to let that happen. She was fiercely ambitious, both for herself and her son.
It makes you wonder about the lengths people will go to for power, even within their own families.
It's a reminder that power dynamics can be pretty ruthless, even in ancient Macedonia.
So we've got Alexander on the throne, potentially through some, let's say, unconventional means. What happens next?
Well, this is where things get interesting. Alexander embarks on a series of military campaigns that will make him a legend.
The Persian campaigns, that's what he's most famous for, right?
Exactly. But as we'll see, even his military triumphs are overshadowed by some pretty brutal actions.
Ah, so this is where the shadows start to emerge.
You got it. To illustrate this, we'll focus on two key events: the Siege of Tyre and the burning of Persepolis.
Those are pretty significant events, especially the burning of Persepolis, such a cultural tragedy.
Let's start with the Siege of Tyre. This was a major turning point in Alexander's campaign against the Persian Empire.
Tyre was a strategically important island city, heavily fortified. It took Alexander's forces 7 months to capture it.
7 months. That's a long time.
Yeah,
I imagine tensions must have been running pretty high by then.
absolutely. And when Tyre finally fell, well, let's just say Alexander didn't exactly show mercy.
The text describes a pretty gruesome scene. Thousands killed, even more sold into slavery.
It was common practice back then, unfortunately, but it still highlights Alexander's capacity for ruthlessness.
It makes you wonder about the psychological impact of such violence, both on the conquered people and on Alexander himself.
Did these actions harden him? Did he ever question the human cost of his victories? It's hard to say for sure.
Let's move on to the burning of Persepolis, which happened after Alexander captured the Persian capital.
Persepolis was renowned for its magnificent palaces and cultural treasures, a symbol of Persian power and sophistication.
And yet, it was burned to the ground. Historians still debate whether it was a deliberate act or an accident.
Some accounts depict it as an impulsive act of drunken revelry. Others believe it was calculated revenge.
A drunken mistake or a calculated act of revenge. Either way, destroying such a cultural center is a huge loss for humanity.
It raises questions about the long-term consequences of conquest. Did Alexander consider the cultural cost? Did he view it as collateral damage in his pursuit of empire?
It's tough to know for sure what was going through his mind, but these events definitely paint a more complex picture of Alexander.
A brilliant military strategist, yes, but also a man capable of great brutality.
It makes you wonder, what other shadows lurk behind this seemingly glorious facade?
Well, that's what we're here to uncover, right? Let's delve a bit deeper into the man himself. As Alexander's power grew, something else seemed to grow alongside it.
His paranoia. The text definitely highlights a shift in his personality. It mentions that he started seeing enemies everywhere.
Even among those who had proven their loyalty time and time again, his closest advisors, his generals.
It's almost like the more successful he became, the more suspicious he got. Like he couldn't trust anyone.
It's interesting, isn't it? The psychology of power, the constant fear of betrayal, the pressure to maintain control.
I guess it makes sense. Ruling a vast empire probably takes a toll on your mental state.
It certainly seems that way in Alexander's case. He executed several close friends and generals based on very little evidence.
Driven by rumors and whispers of conspiracy, the text specifically mentions Parmenion, his most trusted general, and Parmenion's son, Philotas.
Loyal companions betrayed by their king. It's a chilling reminder of how power can corrupt even the strongest bonds.
And then there's the incident with Clitus the Black, a story that really highlights Alexander's, well, his human flaws.
Ah, Cletus. Not just any general, but a close friend. Someone who had even saved Alexander's life in battle.
And yet, during a drunken feast,
An argument erupted, fueled by alcohol, pride, perhaps some underlying resentment.
and Alexander, in a fit of rage, killed Clitus, his own friend.
It's a tragic moment, a stark reminder that even the most revered figures are still human, prone to moments of terrible judgment.
It really makes you think about the role of alcohol in all of this. The text doesn't go into a lot of detail about Alexander's drinking habits.
But it's certainly interesting to consider how it might have influenced his actions, not just in this instance with Clitus, but throughout his reign.
Speaking of complex relationships, let's talk about Hephaestion.
Ah, yes. Hephaestion, Alexander's, well, what was he exactly? The text uses the term romantic relationship.
Their bond was clearly exceptional. Even by ancient standards, they grew up together, fought side by side.
Shared a deep mutual respect and affection. But it's difficult to interpret historical relationships through a modern lens, isn't it?
So how do we make sense of it then? What evidence do we have to go on?
Well, we know that Alexander was utterly devastated by Hephaestion's death. His grief was profound.
He ordered nationwide mourning, commissioned a monumental tomb for Hephaestion, even sought to have him declared a god. That's some serious dedication.
It certainly suggests a level of emotional intensity that goes beyond typical friendship, even for that time period.
It makes you wonder, what did their contemporaries think? Did they view this relationship as, well, something truly unique?
It's certainly possible, and it's important to remember that expressions of intense emotion between men, even physical affection, weren't necessarily taboo in the ancient world.
So the nature of their relationship remains open to interpretation. But the depth of Alexander's grief is undeniable.
It reveals a very human side to this seemingly godlike conqueror, a vulnerability that contrasts sharply with his ruthless reputation.
It's this interplay between myth and reality that makes Alexander's story so compelling, this constant push and pull between his public persona and his private life.
Exactly. And this complexity continues as we move into the later part of Alexander's reign, when his ambition to create a unified empire, well, it starts to face some serious challenges.
He envisioned this grand cosmopolitan empire, right? A melting pot of Greek and Persian cultures. But, as the text points out, not everyone was thrilled about this vision.
His attempts at cultural integration, while perhaps well-intentioned, were met with resistance, both from the conquered populations and, surprisingly, from his own men.
He encouraged intermarriage between Macedonians and Persians, even arranged mass weddings for his soldiers and Persian women. It seems like a pretty radical move for the time.
It was, and many of his soldiers felt betrayed by these policies. They saw it as a dilution of their own traditions.
A sign of favoritism toward the Persians. It's almost ironic. Here's this visionary leader trying to create a more unified world.
And his own people, those who had followed him across continents, are the ones pushing back against his vision.
And this resistance, it eventually boils over, leading to the famous mutiny at the Hyphasis River in 326 BCE.
His soldiers, exhausted after years of relentless campaigning,
Homesick, disillusioned.
they refused to advance further into India. They had reached their breaking point.
This mutiny seems to mark a turning point for Alexander. It's as if his relentless pursuit of conquest finally hit a wall.
He was forced to acknowledge the human cost of his ambition, the toll it had taken on his men.
It's a powerful moment. The invincible Alexander, forced to bend to the will of his exhausted troops.
And it's almost as if this mutiny foreshadows his own rather sudden demise.
Alexander died at the incredibly young age of 32, and, like so much of his life, the circumstances surrounding his death are shrouded in mystery.
Gone too soon, a brilliant life cut short. It's hard to believe such a force of nature could be extinguished so quickly.
The text lays out a few possibilities for his death, right? Fever, poisoning, even assassination. It's like a historical whodunit.
Well, some accounts say he died of a fever, which honestly wouldn't be surprising. Think about the conditions he was constantly exposed to.
Yeah, malaria, typhoid, those were serious threats back then.
And Alexander was always on the move, campaigning in some pretty rough environments.
True, but then there's the poisoning theory. Alexander had his fair share of enemies, right?
Oh, yeah, plenty of people who might have benefited from his demise. A well-placed poison would have been a discreet solution.
It definitely adds another layer of intrigue to the story. So what's the consensus among historians? Any definitive answers?
Nope. The exact cause of Alexander's death remains a mystery. We just don't have enough conclusive evidence to say for sure.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it? Even after all these centuries, there are still so many unanswered questions about Alexander's life and his death.
It's part of what makes him such a fascinating figure, the enigma, the mystery.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about his legacy. He built this massive empire, stretching from Greece all the way to India. What happened to it all after he died?
Well, here's the irony. The Empire Alexander dedicated his life to building. It pretty much fell apart almost immediately after his death.
Oh, why? What happened?
Succession issues. Alexander didn't have a clear heir, which left a huge power vacuum.
I see. So who stepped in to fill that vacuum?
His generals, mostly. They're known as the Daidochi. And let's just say they weren't exactly cooperative.
They started fighting amongst themselves?
Oh, yeah, big time. They
Yeah.
divided the empire into separate kingdoms and then spent decades battling each other for control.
It's kind of tragic, isn't it? Alexander spends his whole life conquering and uniting these vast territories.
And then, poof, it all crumbles the minute he's gone.
It really highlights the fragility of power, doesn't it? No matter how great a conqueror you are, you can't control what happens after you're gone.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that even the mightiest empires are built on, well, on shifting sands. Human ambition, rivalries, these things can topple even the most carefully constructed power structures.
Okay, so let's recap a bit. We've covered Alexander's dramatic rise to power, his incredible military feats, his more controversial actions, his personal relationships, even his mysterious death. It's been quite a journey.
It really has, and it's a journey that reveals so much, not just about Alexander, but about human nature itself, ambition, power, the complexities of leadership.
So how do we, sitting here centuries later, make sense of it all? How should we view Alexander the Great? Hero, villain, something in between.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's tempting to label him as one or the other, but I think it's more complicated than that.
He was a product of his time, right? A
Right.
time when warfare was, well, just a way of life.
Exactly. We can't judge him solely by today's standards, but we can and should acknowledge both the positive and the negative aspects of his legacy.
He was brilliant, innovative, charismatic, but also ruthless, brutal, and perhaps ultimately a bit self-destructive.
He dreamed of a unified world, a world without borders, yet his conquests caused immense suffering.
It's this complexity, this contradiction, that makes Alexander so endlessly fascinating. He wasn't just a name in a history book. He was a real person, a flawed, brilliant, utterly human figure who left an indelible mark on the world. And that's what we've tried to explore today. Not just the legend of Alexander the Great, but the man behind the myth.
The man who, despite all his flaws, continues to capture our imaginations centuries later, and whose story raises important questions about power, ambition, and the human condition, questions that are still relevant today.
So, to our listeners, we leave you with this. What do you think about Alexander? Is he a figure to be admired or condemned, or perhaps a bit of both? We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.